Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and welcome back for part 2 of my Great Guitar Build-Off 2021 build. In today's video, I'm going to be working on the neck. So, first things first, after gluing on the fretboard at the end of the last video, now I'm trimming off the excess on the bandsaw. Once most of the excess fretboard material is removed, I'm going to go over to my router table, which has a flush cutting router bit on it, and I'm going to remove the rest of it flush with the sides of the neck. I do really like how the grain on the side of that Cocobolo fretboard looks, especially considering that's the side that you'll actually be able to see while playing the guitar. So with most of the material removed, there's still some wider bits where the fretboard overhangs the end of the neck, and I'm going to remove that with a small block plane. What I'm doing now is working on putting in a space for a locking nut, because this guitar is going to have a Floyd Rose bridge. So all I've really done to prepare for this is I've marked out where the front edge of the nut is going to be, and I've got the nut sitting here just off camera, and I'm just removing material a little bit at a time, then double checking with the nut itself to make sure that it's cut to the right depth. And once it looks like it's getting close, I'm just going to clean up what's left of this space with a chisel. And once it looks like it's right, and I've got a hard line where I know the front edge of the nut is going to be, so based on that, I'm going to mark out all of the spaces for my fret slots, and then I'm going to begin cutting those by hand. You can kind of see the technique I like to use for cutting fret slots, where I'll put a notch at each end of the slot, one on each side of the fretboard, and then just make them meet across the middle. It's not necessary to do it that way, it's just a way that I like to do it, and I find it gets me pretty accurate results. Once all the fret slots are cut, I'm going to remove all the remaining excess material off the end of the fretboard. And I'm cutting it off at a slight angle here on purpose, just because I think that's going to look better. So now that all that's done, I'm going to go and radius the fretboard. I know some people say it's a lot easier to cut the fret slots after you've radiused the fretboard. I prefer to do it before. I just trust myself to be more accurate when I'm working on a flat surface than a curved surface. But really, you can do it either way. Now for this, I'm putting in a 12-inch radius. That's because with the locking nut and bridge that I have, those are made to a 12-inch radius, so I'm putting that in the match. And of course, I'm also saving a lot of that dust that's come off of the fretboard during this process so that I can use it in a little bit. So after radiusing, I'm going to begin putting in the frets. I like to cut the frets one at a time, or cut and install them one at a time. I just feel like I waste the least amount of fret wire this way. And for this build, I'm going to be nipping off a little bit of the fret tangs on the ends, just so that those aren't right up to the edge of the fretboard. So I just hammer it in, use my fingernail just to check the sides of the fret, make sure it's all the way down in the fret slot. And I also like to cut off the ends of each fret as I go, because I find that up near the higher frets, they get so close together that snipping off the ends can become somewhat difficult. But if you do them one at a time, it's not a problem. And once all the frets are in and the ends are cut, I'm taking some of that dust that I saved from when I radiused the board, and I'm going to pack that into the ends of the fret slots, and then flood some super glue over it to fill those in. Ideally, I would have liked to do this with a more accurate bottle of super glue with like one of those little wicking tips, but I didn't have any of those on hand, and this pretty much needed to get done, so I used what I had. And then on a few fret slots that look like they're not quite filled, I'm just going to pack in a little bit more dust before the glue dries. And then after the glue is dry, I'm going to take a fret leveling file, and I'm just going to work down the ends of the frets to get them flush with the edges of the fretboard. And this is also going to remove most of the built up glue and dust that's on the edges as well. And then once the fret ends are flush, I'm going to take a sanding block and just smooth off all of the rest of the excess glue that was on the sides of the neck. At this point, I'm moving on to applying the facing to the headstock, but before I can do that, I want to widen out the access to the truss rod a little bit, just make it look a bit nicer. And just a quick little bit of work with the Dremel opens that up, and then I'm going to go and take one of these offcuts from the top that's going to go on the body, and I'm going to, well, you can see I've already roughly cut it into the shape of the headstock, and now I'm going to split it down so that it's thin enough to be a facing for the headstock. There's also a second reason for splitting it like this, and you'll see that soon. And of course here I'm just cutting it down closer to what its final shape is going to be so that I have less excess to remove later. Now here I'm cutting out some material to make room for, or rather make an opening for the truss rod access. This is also going to leave a space for the truss rod cover. So just carefully cutting that as close to the lines as I can on the bandsaw. Then I'm going to clamp this down to my bench and use some hand files to finalize that shape. I know some people get upset at me for wearing gloves while I'm working, particularly with power tools, and I do realize that there's a bit of risk involved in that, but you know, it's still cold where I live. And there's also a risk in working with power tools when your hands are too numb for you to control them properly, so I do occasionally wear gloves. In fact, about 5 minutes after I finished doing this, it was snowing outside again. But I digress. Here's the other reason why I split that piece for the face of the headstock, because the grain is still going to match pretty closely to the piece that I'm actually going to glue to the headstock. This means that I can use this extra piece. It's a little bit thicker than the one that's going to be glued onto the headstock, and I'm going to cut out a piece for the truss rod cover that is going to match the grain on the face of the headstock now. So after taking it to a leveling beam and working down the sides and finishing the shape a bit, it looks like it fits. So now that part's done, I'm ready to glue the facing onto the headstock. Here, using offcut from another one of my builds. This was from the 7-string Zerakote and Black Lima guitar. I'll throw a link to that up if you're interested. And yeah, it's worth noting, I save every cut off piece of wood from every guitar I've made, because you never know when you're going to find a use for them. This happens to be that so far in this build I've mostly used them as clamping cauls. But now that the glue for the headstock is dry, I'm going to work down that shape on the spindle sander just to even it up. And now I'm going to do an inlay. So normally I would do an inlay at the 12th fret rather than on the headstock, but because the fretboard has a really interesting kind of swirl in the grain right around the 12th fret, I didn't want to put the inlay there and just kind of ruin that. So I decided to put it up here on the headstock instead. And I started just by drilling out a couple of little holes so that the precision router bit could get in there easily, and then routed out most of the material. But of course, it being a router bit, it cuts round spaces, or round corners, so I need to go in with chisels and a knife to sharpen some of the corners. Here you can see the inlay material. I've got some brass flake, it's a nice and bright gold color, and some opal. I'm going to start by just putting a light coating of that gold-colored metal flake in the bottom, and then I'm going to start laying opal over the top of that. Just carefully arranging with some tweezers. Try and fill up as much of the space as I can with the opal, because I don't want there to be too many gaps in between the shiny, bright colors. I'm going to flood a little bit more super glue over that. But there are still gaps in between the pieces of opal, so I'm going to take more of that gold flake powder and just kind of sprinkle it over the top to fill in those gaps. And once all that's sprinkled on there, I'm going to go ahead and flood even more super glue over it. And then once all that glue is dry, I'm going to begin sanding this flat with the face of the headstock. Just roughly sanding it down to get it smooth. Starting with like 80 grit, then 120. And I actually polished this up to 320 just so that we can see that the inlay stones and the powder really shine. Because even at 320, it's nice and shiny. So I've done that, I'm ready to begin carving the neck profile. And I do this a little bit differently than I've seen it described. They do say for the first cut they mark out a space halfway between the fretboard and the back of the neck. I usually go halfway from the top of the fretboard to the back of the neck. I just find that I like that neck profile a little bit better when you do it that way. It's a subtle difference, but it's one that I like. So once most of the profile for the neck is carved in, I'm going to mark out the shape I want for my volute, and then I'm going to begin carving that in with a half-round rasp. Of course, the rasp leaves a pretty rough surface, so I'm going to go in and sand that smooth. So first by hand, that wasn't really effective enough, so I brought in my small random orbital sander just to get that cleaned up, and this is also shaping the volute a little bit farther. But at this point, the neck is almost done. There's still some more fretwork to be done, and of course I still need to drill holes for the tuners, and the heel of the neck still needs to be shaped, but that relies on some work on the body being done first, so that's where I'm going to end this video, where most of the work on the neck is done. So I'll say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you around for the next one, where we should be working on the body.